My wife Cheryl and I run a farm outside Buckingham, Iowa, where we mostly grow corn. This happened in August of 2018, on a damp evening with light rain falling now and then. Cheryl and I have lived the farm life our entire lives. It is really the only kind of life we have ever known. Out here in rural Iowa, there is a lot of land and very few people around. Our nearest neighbors were George and Kenny, each living about half a mile away in opposite directions. They were farmers too. When you live somewhere like this, there is not much going on, so you naturally get close with the people who live nearby. We often had George and Kenny and their wives over to our place, and sometimes we would go over to theirs as well. On this particular weekend night, George and his wife were visiting us for drinks. We ended up getting pretty drunk while sitting around playing board games together. They headed home around 11. Thankfully, their house was basically right down the road, a straight drive that takes maybe 30 seconds. After they left, Cheryl and I kept sipping wine while watching one of our favorite movies. We were both starting to feel pretty sleepy. The wine had definitely caught up with us. We were probably just going to fall asleep on the couch together when suddenly someone knocked on the front door. Hearing a knock at that hour was strange. In fact, it had never happened before. Along with the knocking, we thought we heard someone speaking on the other side of the door. I lowered the TV volume so we could listen more closely. We waited a moment. About 20 seconds later, there was another round of knocking, followed by a muffled voice saying something we could not fully make out. I started to stand up to answer the door when Cheryl grabbed my arm. I looked over at her, and she shook her head with a worried expression. I whispered that I would just ask who it was. She quietly told me not to let them know we were home, although the truth was they probably already knew. I walked up to the door and called out, "Who is it?" The voice outside replied through the door, "Oh, thank God. Could you please open up? We are lost." I asked, "Who exactly is we?" The voice answered, "My wife and I." I said back, "Can your wife say something so I know you are not alone?" There was silence for a few seconds. Then I said again, "Did you hear me?" The same voice replied, "Yeah, but she is not right next to me right now." At that moment, alarms started going off in my head, and I noticed the voice sounded strange. It felt like a man who was trying to make his voice sound slightly higher. I chuckled and said, "George, is that you?" George had a goofy side, and if he had been drinking, it would not be shocking if he tried a prank like that. The voice answered yes, but now it sounded deeper. For a moment, I actually felt relieved, thinking it really was George after all, but I still did not want to open the door without confirming it first. Having someone show up at your house late at night in the middle of farmland, claiming they are lost, just does not happen. Out here it immediately feels suspicious. I called through the door. "Prove it then. What is your wife's name?" A voice that did not sound familiar answered, "That is a trick question." My smile vanished instantly. I grabbed my phone to call George. Cheryl had been watching the whole situation and kept telling me we should call the police. I told her to wait a second. The phone rang 3 times before George answered. The first thing I asked him was, "Are you standing at my front door right now?" He sounded confused and said no. Why would I be? I explained that someone was outside our door pretending to be him, trying to get me to let them in. He said he would come over immediately, and we hung up. Remember that all of us were still pretty drunk during this whole situation. A moment later, the knocking started again. I shouted through the door that I had a shotgun ready if they did not leave our property right away. The voice answered back, saying they only needed to use a phone. That was all they wanted. Cheryl was already dialing 911 by then. Living this far out means it can take a very long time for an officer to reach you. While Cheryl was on the phone, we heard footsteps moving across the wooden deck that wraps around our house. It sounded like more than one person walking out there. The steps eventually stopped near one of the windows where the blinds were closed. Then we heard someone trying to lift the window open. That was when Cheryl yelled into the phone for them to leave us alone. I shouted as loudly as I could for them to get off our property, or I would shoot. Only then did it occur to me that I should actually grab my shotgun from the upstairs closet. I ran up to get it. Just a few seconds later, we heard loud pounding at the door again. This time, it really was George yelling for us to open up. I let him inside right away, and he had brought his shotgun with him. He told us he did not see anyone when he pulled into our driveway. George stayed with us until a police officer eventually arrived. The officer walked around the property with us and took a quick look around before leaving. He recommended we install cameras on the front and back of the house. Strangely enough, that was something we had never even considered before this happened. Even now, it still gives me chills thinking that the only thing separating us from whoever was out on our deck that night was a simple wooden door. This story happened at my grandparents' farm during the summer of 2018. One night, I was staying there by myself because my grandparents were out of town. They were paying me to keep an eye on the property for a couple of nights. On the final evening, I was relaxing in the living room, watching television, when I started hearing a strange noise coming from the cornfield outside. At first, I ignored it. Farms are full of random sounds at night, and I assumed it was probably just a deer moving through the crops. But a few moments later, all the cows started mooing at once. Normally, you might hear one cow here and there, but never the entire herd at the same time. When every cow starts making noise together, something is wrong. Something must have frightened them badly. Since I was the only person on the farm, it was my responsibility to figure out what was happening. I went over to the closet to grab a coat so I could step outside. Just as I was about to open the door, I heard a loud, high-pitched scream from one of the cows. I froze where I stood, feeling completely terrified. Something was clearly very wrong with the animals. Without thinking much more about it, I ran upstairs to my grandfather's bedroom. He always kept a few guns under his bed. I grabbed his hunting rifle and loaded it before heading outside. The cows were still making a lot of noise. I walked toward the barn to check on them. At first, nothing seemed unusual. All the stalls looked normal, and most of the cows were there. Then I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. One of the stalls was empty. I knew for a fact that the cow had been tied up earlier that evening. It made no sense for it to suddenly disappear. As I stood there trying to figure it out, I thought I heard another strange high-pitched moo coming from the cornfield behind the barn. So I stepped outside again and started walking toward the field. While I was moving closer, I suddenly thought I heard voices. It sounded like people quietly talking somewhere in the crops. That was when my patience ran out. I raised the rifle and fired 2 shots straight into the air. Everything instantly went silent. The cows stopped making noise, and the voices disappeared. For a few seconds, there was nothing but complete silence. Then I heard footsteps moving through the corn. I honestly did not want to go into the field, but I felt like I had no choice. Farmers keep guns for situations exactly like this. I could not just hide in the house while strangers were walking around the property. So I slowly stepped into the rows of corn. As I moved deeper inside, I could hear several sets of footsteps around me. They sounded close, like people were walking through the rows nearby. My fear kept growing with every step. Then suddenly I stopped. Down one row of corn, only a few feet away, stood a person dressed entirely in black. I quickly lifted the rifle and shouted at him to leave the field. I was not bluffing. If he tried anything, I was ready to fire, but he did not react at all. I fired another round into the air to scare him away. Even after that, he did not move. Instead, he slowly began walking toward me, his arms slightly raised as if he wanted me to lower the gun. I pointed the rifle directly at him and screamed again for him to stay back. That was when I noticed something that made the situation even worse. I was not dealing with just one person. When I looked around, I realized there were several other figures standing between the rows of corn. At least 6 or 7 people were surrounding me. Those were only the ones I could see. There could have been more hidden in the field. As the man stepped closer, I could see that he and the others were all wearing disturbing masks. He stopped moving when I started backing away. For a few seconds, everyone stood completely still. The fear I felt in that moment is impossible to fully describe. I honestly believed I might die right there. Then they began chanting. I could not understand what they were saying. It sounded like a different language, almost like some kind of eerie song. My mind started racing. I wondered if they were planning some kind of ritual, and that I had accidentally walked straight into it. That was when I decided to run. I turned and sprinted down several rows of corn as fast as I could. Once I got some distance between us, I stopped, turned around, and fired about 6 shots in their direction. Immediately, I heard movement and a sound of people running through the crops away from me. The rustling plants and footsteps quickly faded into the distance. I had finally scared them off. Breathing heavily, I started heading back toward the farmhouse. While walking back, I noticed something lying on the ground. What I saw there is something I will never forget. In the middle of a small circle of candles sat the severed head of a cow. The sight made my stomach turn. As soon as I got back inside the farmhouse, I ran to the bathroom and threw up. After that, grabbed the house phone and called the police. I explained everything that had happened as clearly as I could. The dispatcher told me an officer was already on the way. Once I finished the call, I phoned my parents and told them the entire story. I asked them to come pick me up immediately. My dad said they would be there in about an hour. I went upstairs to my grandfather's room and sat there shaking and crying while I waited. It felt like forever before I finally heard a police car pull up outside. I rushed outside to meet the officer, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. I explained the entire situation again while he listened carefully. He checked the barn first and then walked a short distance into the cornfield, where he eventually found the cowhead. After seeing that, he called for additional officers since the farm was now considered an active crime scene. Not long after that, my parents arrived. The first officer spoke with them, and I repeated everything that had happened. Thankfully, my parents took me home that night. My grandparents were extremely disturbed when they heard the story. Soon after the incident, they installed a large security camera system all around the property. To this day, I have no idea who those people were. But judging by what I saw that night, they were clearly performing some kind of animal sacrifice or disturbing ritual. And unfortunately, I was the one unlucky enough to be alone on the farm when they decided to do it. My name is Howard. I am 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm. When my parents leave town, I am the one who stays behind to help take care of everything. Our place is just a small family farm. It is nothing like the big commercial operations you see on television. My parents have always assumed that one day I will take it over when they are too old to run it themselves. I am the oldest of 3 kids and the only son, so the responsibility kind of falls on me. The truth is, though, I am not sure that is the life I want. I cannot really picture myself spending my entire life out here in rural Arkansas. That feeling only got stronger after something strange happened last July. My parents had gone away for a week on a romantic vacation. That left my 2 sisters, Crystal and Morgan, and me in charge of the farm while they were gone. Out here, there is not much around us. It is quiet, private, and honestly a little too isolated for my taste. Most nights are peaceful. This night was not. It started late in the evening when we were all beginning to wind down before bed. Both of my sisters take their college classes online. Crystal was still working on a summer course, sitting in her room with her laptop open and headphones on. Morgan and I were hanging out in the living room, watching some random television show that neither of us cared much about. None of us are really thrilled about the idea of spending our lives working this farm. I probably feel it the most since I am the oldest and right in the middle of my 20s. One of the things people do not think about when it comes to farm life is dealing with predators. Sometimes that means animals that sneak in to destroy crops or go after livestock. Other times the predators are people who decide to steal from you. Believe it or not, that kind of thing actually happens. It has not happened often to us, but it has happened before. Because of that, we keep a few guns in the house. That night, our 2 dogs, who stay outside in the yard, suddenly started barking like crazy. Something clearly had them worked up. I stepped outside to see what they were reacting to. Both of them were facing the direction of the crops and barking nonstop. I told them to quiet down, and after a moment, they finally did. I walked up to the edge of the crops and listened carefully. That is when I heard it. A whistling sound coming from somewhere inside the cornfield. It was not the wind or some animal. It sounded exactly like a person whistling. This was the first time I had ever dealt with someone trespassing on our property while my dad was not around. I rushed back inside, thinking I should grab one of the guns. As soon as I got in, the dogs started barking again. I told my sisters that there was someone out in the cornfield and that I was going to run out there and scare them off. Both of them immediately said that was a terrible idea. Running into a dark cornfield after a stranger in the middle of the night was not exactly smart. Once they said it out loud, I realized they were right. The thought of doing that suddenly seemed pretty terrifying. Instead, I went back outside while the dogs continued barking toward the crops. I pointed the gun up into the air and fired a warning shot. The sound echoed across the fields, and for a moment, everything went quiet, including the dogs. In the heat of the moment, I also shouted as loudly as I could for whoever was out there to get off our land. Feeling a little confident after that, I went back inside. My sister started laughing at me, and soon I was laughing too. It felt like maybe the whole thing had just been some idiot passing through. The laughter did not last very long. A minute later, the dogs started barking again. This time they sounded even more frantic than before. I stepped outside again, planning to do the same thing. But when I walked into the yard, my heart practically jumped out of my chest. There was a man standing about 20 feet away from the dogs, right at the edge of the cornfield. He looked straight at me. I yelled "Hey" as loud as I could. The second I did, that he turned and ran into the corn. I ran a few steps toward the dogs and fired another shot into the air. Then I stopped. There was no way. I was about to chase someone into that field in the dark. That would have been insane. I also did not want to leave the dogs outside where they were. So I unclipped their chains from the hooks and brought both of them into the house. When I got inside, I told my sisters that someone had been sneaking around in the cornfield. The first thing we did after that was call our dad. He told me that while he was gone, I had to be the man of the house and make sure my sisters were safe. If the person came back, he suggested firing another warning shot to scare them off. After the call, we all slowly went to our rooms. Each of my sisters took one of the dogs with them, and I kept the gun in my room. We were all a little shaken up after what had just happened. My window was open that night, and I was lying in bed watching a movie on my laptop. Then I heard it again, whistling. It was coming from outside. I quickly went to the window and looked out. In the dim light, I could see someone slowly walking across the grass. Then, almost like he sensed that I was watching him, he stopped. He turned his head and looked straight toward my window while still whistling. It felt like he was deliberately trying to scare us. That was a very stupid move, considering I had already made it clear that I had a gun. I grabbed the gun from the bed and aimed it out the window. I fired a shot into the grass a few feet away from where he was standing, making sure not to hit him. That ended his creepy little act immediately. He took off running and disappeared from my view toward the front of the house. After that, he never came back. He would have been an idiot to show up again, after that warning. Of course, I told my sisters why I'd fired the shot and reassured them that whoever it was would not return. To this day, we never figured out who that person was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some teenagers trying to scare people for fun. Or maybe it was someone who had much worse intentions.